Come join me on another adventure.
You know, when you think of getting around Florida today, you probably picture I-95 or the Turnpike, right? But long before any of that asphalt was ever poured, Florida had its own superhighways, and they weren't made of pavement. They were the state's incredible winding river systems. So today, we're going to take a trip back in time and explore the amazing golden age of the steamboat.
All right, so here's our plan. First, we'll look at what passed for highways back then. Then we'll get into the age of the steamboat itself. We're going to explore one journey that became world famous, see how these boats were the real engines of the economy, and finally, figure out why it all came to an end.
I mean, seriously, think about it. It's a question we just don't have to ask ourselves anymore. We can zip across the state in a few hours. But back in the 1800s, Florida was a wild frontier. Getting from the coast to anywhere inland wasn't just a pain, it was a massive, massive challenge that basically dictated how the entire state grew.
Okay, let's dive into our first section. We need to set the scene and really get a feel for the geography that made this whole transportation revolution so absolutely necessary.
You've got to understand, back then, there were really two completely different Floridas. You had your coastal cities, like Jacksonville, which were totally connected to the rest of the world by ships. But then there was the interior. And those little towns and settlements, they were almost completely cut off. The biggest problem was there was just no reliable way to get from one to the other.
And this is where our hero comes steaming into the picture, the steamboat. For its time, this thing was a technological marvel. It could finally navigate those rivers and create the first real, dependable link between the busy coast and the lonely interior. These boats became Florida's first true transportation network.
So now that we've got our hero, what was it actually like to travel back then? Well, let's just say these trips were something you'd never, ever forget.
And what's so cool about this is that a steamboat trip wasn't just one standard experience. Oh no, the whole journey changed depending on the river you were on. And the two main routes, well, they were like night and day.
So on one hand, you had Lake George. Just picture it. Huge, wide open water, big sky. It was just grand and majestic. But then there was the Ocklawaha River, and it was the total opposite. We're talking narrow, twisting, so close to the shore you felt like you could reach out and touch the trees. It was like a trip through a lost, exotic jungle.
In fact, that Ocklawaha trip was so incredibly unique that it stopped being just a way to get somewhere. It actually became a world-famous destination all on its own.
I'm not kidding. People came from all over the globe just to take this boat ride. The scenery was like nothing they'd ever seen before. These massive cypress trees, all this lush green, and wildlife everywhere. The advertisements called it a trip through an exotic paradise. And you know what? It absolutely was.
And if you need any proof of how big a deal this was, just look at the passenger lists. They were basically a who's who of the time. You had famous authors like Harriet Beecher Stowe, yep, the one who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and even U.S. presidents made the journey. Everyone wanted to see this wild, unique piece of America for themselves.
But hey, it wasn't all just tourism and sightseeing. These steamboats had a very serious day job. They were the hard-working engines that were literally building Florida's economy.
Right, so here's the bottom line. These boats were the state's economic lifeblood. They'd haul all that valuable citrus and lumber out of the deep interior to the coast to be sold. And on the way back, they were loaded with all the essential supplies those remote towns needed to survive. They were, quite literally, floating supply chains.
But you know how these stories go. All golden ages have to end. And the very same thing that made the steamboat a superstar, technology, was about to bring in a new champion.
You can really see the whole story right here on this timeline. For decades, the steamboat was king, no question. But as the 1800s start to wrap up, you begin to hear a new sound in the air. The whistle of a steam engine. The rise of the railroad was incredibly fast, and it changed everything.
So why the big shift? Well, it all came down to some pretty basic advantages. Steamboats were amazing, but they were stuck on the rivers. They were kind of slow, and if the water got too low, well, you were out of luck. Railroads, on the other hand, you could build tracks almost anywhere. They were way faster, more direct, and they ran all year round, rain or shine.
It was a battle of technologies, and the railroad was destined to win. Its speed and reliability were just unbeatable.
And so the commercial steamboat era, which had been the heart of Florida for so long, just slowly and quietly faded into the history books.
So why are we talking about this today? Why does it matter? Because this whole forgotten era is literally the foundation for the Florida we know. The routes those steamboats took laid the groundwork. The towns they connected, the industries they supported, you can still see the ghost of that network in the way Florida is laid out right now.
And that kind of leaves you with one last thing to think about. Just like those old Florida rivers, the world around us is filled with these forgotten histories, these invisible highways. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What bygone technologies and forgotten journeys helped shape the world right outside your own window?